I don't know if I'd say that I don't have solutions. I just think that there aren't easy answers, and the solutions that are available are difficult and take time, and there aren't any quick fixes when we talk about a region as troubled as the Middle East. So yeah, I definitely take the point that it's hard for people who aren't maybe familiar with the Middle East or Islam to kind of make sense of all of this. It seems very messy and complicated. But that's why I hope that, books like mine can help at least encourage a more nuanced, constructive discussion on these issues. I mean, I myself have realized more and more that Islam is a really complicated religion, and that's speaking as an American Muslim. So even those of us who are part of the religion, it's challenging to make sense of different interpretations, different schools of law, how to apply pre-modern concepts to the modern era. These are all debates that Muslims have been having for a long time, and Muslims themselves don't agree on the answers. That's part of why there is conflict and violence in the Middle East, because of a lack of clear solutions. My hope in the Middle East is kind of modest, because I do believe that people will continue to hate each other for understandable reasons, because there are real differences when it comes to big issues, existential issues like the role of religion in public life, Islam's relationship to the state, and so on. So I'm under no illusion that people are going to get together and be all, hunky-dory about resolving their differences. But my hope is that they can resolve their differences through peaceful, democratic processes. The problem is when there isn't democracy in the region, when there aren't, where people can't vote for their own representatives, then there isn't a clear way to resolve those differences peacefully, and people resort to violence and the force of arms. And that's precisely, I think, what we've seen over the past few years. As Americans, we have to be honest about our own role, and I think we have a tragic history of not very constructive involvement in the Middle East. And part of that has to do with decades of supporting autocratic regimes and strong men who, and we contradicted our own values. I mean, we say we believe in democracy in theory, but in practice, that's not what we've supported in the region. So whether it's supporting military coups or repressive regimes, the list goes on. And I think that's one grievance that you'll hear from people in the Middle East. Oh, why don't we support peaceful protesters or democratic elections and so on? That's part of it, but also there are other more specific things like the legacy of the Iraq War, what is perceived to be our lack of support for Palestinian rights and uncritical support for Israel. So there's a long list of grievances that you'll hear when you talk to people from across the political spectrum in the Middle East. I think there's a couple different things here. I mean, one is that there is a pro-Israel lobby in the U.S., obviously. I think, unfortunately, in the Middle East, it goes well beyond that, where they're not able sometimes to make distinctions between Israel and Jews and Zionists. So there is an anti-Semitism problem in parts of the Middle East, and that's something you hear on a regular basis, whether it's in the press or national television and so on. So I think that kind of contributes to a culture of conspiracy theorizing. And it's not just about Israel, but also about, America is doing this. And so for example, one thing that I've heard more than I would like to hear is this idea that America has been supporting ISIS, or it's America's fault that ISIS exists, or it's a creation, and so on. So I think that's not part of where that comes from, is people in the region feel powerless because they cannot express themselves through a democratic process, because they don't have the right to protest in most countries, that this sense of powerlessness contributes to looking for scapegoats, or people are trying to find, they're trying to find scapegoats to justify their very difficult situation in their own countries. For sure. So, after the Arab Spring, so part of the problem with revolutions is that they are good in the sense that people can express themselves really, for the first time in some cases, and they can protest and so on. But the dark side of it is that revolution raises expectations. People believe, for example, in Egypt or Tunisia, after they got rid of their dictators, that things would get better quickly, that there would be an improvement in living standards, in employment and opportunities. So the revolutions made people believe in something. They were more optimistic about their own lives. But the problem was their expectations weren't met. So there was a gap between what they thought or hoped would happen and what actually ended up happening. Revolutions lead to chaotic situations. It's hard for the economy to get back on track. There are power vacuums in these countries. There are sometimes, extremist and militant groups which are able to take advantage of power vacuums. So revolution is not a quick fix. And I think that it was also unrealistic for us as Americans to have such high hopes ourselves and think, oh, people are protesting, people power, and immediately things would improve and we could talk about a Middle East that was going on the right path. Those expectations were never realistic. Democratic transitions are historically messy, they're complicated, even sometimes bloody. And I think what we saw in the Middle East is that people weren't able to talk about religion and politics in an open public way for decades. So all of those things had been suppressed and bubbling underneath the surface. And when there are democratic openings, those things come to the fore for the first time. So people are arguing with each other over very charged topics, and that leads to polarization. I'm very much a proponent of the U.S. supporting democracy and political reform abroad. I am the child of immigrants. My parents grew up under an authoritarian regime, and I feel like what's so special to me about America and the American project is what we stand for as a country. And it's been very troubling to me to see how we haven't been willing to live up to our own ideals. And I was hoping that when the Arab Spring started, there would be a real commitment from the Obama administration, not just to have good rhetoric, but to commit significant financial resources and billions of dollars of aid to helping these countries rebuild and helping them get through a difficult democratic transition. That's not what happened. And I think it's not just about aid and political support, but also in the case of Syria, I think that there was much more the Obama administration could have done to diminish the Assad regime's ability to kill its own citizens. I mean, here's one of the most brutal regimes in recent decades that we've seen really anywhere, the regime of Bashar al-Assad. And he's killed, hundreds of thousands of his own people, right? And the fact that we weren't willing to do really much about that, and we essentially standed by silently while more and more people were killed, I think that will stand as one of the tragic legacies of the Obama era. And this is where I think one of the lessons learned of the past really 15 years is that the Bush administration played a destructive role because it was too militaristic in the region. It was too dependent on military force. But I think what we've seen here is the opposite side, which is that non-intervention can also be destructive. And there are times when the U.S. and its allies should be willing to stop mass killing and genocide. And if the U.S. doesn't play a leadership role on that, then no one else will, because part of the problem here is we set the tone for international involvement. And I think one of the problems with Syria in particular, why I'm focusing on that, is because of the spillover effects across the region. Our unwillingness to do more on Syria doesn't just affect Syrians. What we've seen is that that's given ISIS a chance to establish itself in parts of Syria because of the power vacuum. And then ISIS was revived, and we saw ISIS spilling over into Iraq and elsewhere. So the lesson here is that, in a way, in the Middle East, everything is interconnected. So there has to be a broader vision. There has to be a broader strategy. And sometimes that requires more American leadership, more American involvement. That doesn't mean we should ever go back to the 2003 Iraq model of a full-on invasion. No one is advocating that. But what I hope going forward is that we as Americans can find a middle ground between the something like the Iraq invasion of 2003 on one hand, and non-intervention and doing nothing or doing little on the other. There should be a middle path that we can take. Well, I think that that's actually for me at least, that's an easy question to answer. Look, I mean, Hillary is not, there's always going to be criticisms about any presidential candidate, but when it comes to Hillary Clinton versus Trump, I think it's easy in the sense that Donald Trump is scary to me. First of all, we don't exactly know what he really believes, and that's why it's hard to talk about what he would actually do if he was president. But here is someone who has shown a great degree of anti-Muslim bigotry. And I think that if we are trying to fight terrorism in the Middle East and we're trying to build relationships with Muslim publics and governments, to have someone who has said such inflammatory things about Muslims and about Islam as a religion, I think that's going to make it very difficult for us to engage effectively in the Middle East and in the broader Muslim world. Hillary Clinton, on the other hand, is tried and tested. She knows what she's doing, and I think that competence is something that we need, regardless of what specific objections or faults people might point to when it comes to Hillary's record. But I think what we need now is a steady hand, and I don't think that's what Trump is really offering right now. Let's put it that way.